You said it was something like, we've lost 3 generations of rebels and we've turned them into medical conformists or something like that. It was a very powerful statement. Why do you think they target children?
I think they target children for the same reason that Jesuits have targeted children. They basically, give me a child, and I'll make sure that the child becomes what I want them to be. They regard children as the vehicle, as the medium. Child rearing and socializing children should really have as its focus a commitment to educating them for freedom and educating them for independence. Whereas what we're doing now is we're making them powerless and dependent. Family life is much more problematic now than it was in the past.
Oh, well, that's so sad.
It's more than sad. It's a tragedy because, for children to develop a strong identity, to cultivate their sense of independence, they need that kind of family background, that kind of platform that the family gives them. 2 things that we can give to our children is roots.
Yeah.
And with their roots, then we can give them wings so they can fly.
What can we do, to kind of harness ourselves and push back?
I'm a big fan of what I call amongst friends subversive parenting, where you seek to subvert the parental regime that is kind of being imposed upon us, because that's the way. If you can create an environment where children are freed from some of this ideological burden that is imposed upon them, and we begin to socialize them in what I call real values.
So hello, Frank Furedi. I'm thrilled to have you on our podcast. I think I've been following your work for many years, and I'd love you to kind of introduce yourself and let our listeners know where you've come from the beginning. Even you were born in Hungary and then I think you came to Canada. If you could tell us the whole lot, because where you ended up is kind of fascinating.
Right. Thanks for having me. So basically, I was born in Hungary, and we left Hungary during the Hungarian Revolution, or when it was defeated, because both my sister and my dad were very active in the revolution. So we ended up going to Canada, which is where I grew up, went to university there. And then I got involved in a radical student politics in the 60s, got blacklisted from all the Canadian universities from doing a PhD. So I came to Britain. That's the reason why I came to Britain. Never had any intention of staying here. So I arrived in 1969, and I got involved again in radical left kind of politics while doing my PhD, and got involved with a group of people, and we set up an organization called the Revolutionary Communist Party, which was a radical left-wing organization, mainly committed to theoretical exploration. We were always very different than the rest of the left, because we always felt that left-wing ideas were just simply not good enough, but they were just simply ideas that you borrowed from the past, rather than developing a sensibility that was oriented to our time, and got criticized for that. I knew that I was not really part of the left in the 1970s, when there was a big debate about banning the National Front. There was a big campaign that said no platform for the National Front. And I argued that, in a sense, banning an organization because of their beliefs is utterly wrong, because we had an obligation to argue and debate them, and finding a cheap bureaucratic method of silencing them was really unworthy of people who took themselves seriously, who felt that they were progressive. As a result, that was the first time I got called of being a fascist or a fan of fascist, even though my whole life I struggled against racism and fascism. We set up an organization, Workers Against Racism, in East London, and we actually fought physically the National Front. But anyways, to make a long story short, in the 1980s, we basically realized that even though we were on the left, we weren't on the left, because many of our ideas were so different. And we began to question some of the ideals that today is called woke, but which in the very early stage was simply identity politics. As it emerged, it will crystallize into what is now called woke, and gradually we began to realize that, in a sense, we were living on borrowed time. We decided to disband the party in the late 90s, or 1966, 97, I'm not sure. and decided that what was really important for people like me is to write a lot of books, to think, to reflect, to kind of go back and forth. And I've been involved in the project of doing a lot of writing and doing journalism. But I guess what I'm really proud of is that over those years, I wrote about 26 books that some of them I think are really good, at the risk of sounding arrogant.
They are.
But I think I was the first one to raise very question about the way we parent children. I wrote a book called Paranoid Parenting, which drew attention to the way we were protecting kids in a really unhelpful way. I wrote a book on therapy culture, the way that psychology was being used as a way of socializing young people rather than socializing them through values. I wrote a series of books on fear. I could go on and on and on, but I think a lot of those books, for me, they were exercises in clarifying my own thinking. And, I feel really good that over the years, that's worked quite well. While I was doing this, I was also a professor of sociology at the University of Kent in Canterbury. And probably the thing I'm most proud of is that over the years, I kind of supervised about 50 or so PhD students. And many of those PhD students have gone on and done really great things. I mean, I really feel that, I kind of played a bit of a role in educating them and maybe pushing them forward, stretching them. So that's really where I am. And more laterally, I decided to pay a bit of attention to what's going on in Europe. I became extremely worried about the way the culture war is fought out in Europe, and became really worried in the way that the European Union promotes all very kind of horrible ideas, from transgenderist ideology to kind of political ideals that are very much about promoting identity issues rather than having a much more future-oriented outlook. And I'm now involved in running an organization called MCC Brussels. I'm its director, which is attempts to create a network of people who are interested in fighting the culture war, but from our side. That's to say, questioning the whole cultural turn that has occurred and the attempt to basically not take seriously the social and existential concerns of people. So that's in short. It's a lot to get in because I have lived a long time. I'm now 77. I'll be 78 in May, and it's when the thing that really fascinates me is so much has happened in my life. It's just unbelievable when I think back the stuff that I've been through. It's such a privilege, being a 60s person, and then getting involved in left-wing politics, and then finding a different road, a different journey. So I feel very lucky that I think I was in the right place at the right time. Not always, but most of the time.
You're certainly a man ahead of your time. Like I read Paranoid Parenting when I was having kids, and it was pivotal for me. It was huge, massive, massive influence on me, and thankfully my parenting. So I thank you for that. But you wrote Therapy Culture in 2003. Now Abigail Shrier just wrote Bad Therapy in 2024, 21 years later. And she's saying pretty much what you were saying in 2003, that this culture is the problem. Mm-hmm. And you went on, to another book, which was License to Hug, about the child protection policies. And, the policies are kind of, in a way, they have a stranglehold on us. And so I was very interested when you gave a talk. It was very, very powerful talk you gave at the conference in Lisbon, the GenSpec conference. You said this line that's been ringing in my head ever since. You said, basically how trans policies have been embedded within the European culture. So you said something like, whether you're a theatre group in Croatia or you're building a road in Poland, they're going to ask you, what are you doing about trans? And you just had this image of these Polish builders who are looking for a grant, throw in pride flags onto the funding application. And I've no doubt they did it. And I've no doubt they threw in a few kind of things that actually it permeates the culture in so many ways. Have you done much of a deep dive on the European, I suppose, policies around trans, or are you just aware of it in a lighter sense?
Oh no, we're doing serious research on it. I got somebody working on the way that the EU finances different NGOs that are involved in the gender-related issues, the trans issues, and all the other ones. So, for example, we now discover that they basically, have spent loads and loads of money promoting under the flag of inclusion, promoting trans issues in many parts of Europe, and almost all the gender policies, all the policies to do with transgender ideology, are recycled from NGOs who are committed to them. They're basically transgenderist activists. If you look at their funding, they are actually funded by the EU. So you got this parasitic relationship between the EU Commission and the NGOs, where they basically say these are the stakeholders that we're consulting. But it just so happens that the stakeholders that they're consulting are also the people who receive EU Commission largesse. So what you end up with a situation where policymaking on gender-related matters is framed entirely by organizations that are kind of committed to a particular view of these issues.
Wow. Go ahead, Mia.
I recall. Do I recall in your GenSpec speech that you called it gender mainstreaming or something? This is the full-on thrust. There's the hard and the soft, I think you said. My question is, do you think that the assault had to be so coordinated and so well funded and so intense because of what their goals are? Like in the past, gay rights, we just had to accept gay people loved whomever they loved. Women's rights, women got the vote, whereas trans rights is a full-on assault on reality, a whole new reality. So they had to do it in such an intense way.
Well, also in a surreptitious way, because the way they do it is basically emphasize the importance of equality between men and women, which nobody can possibly object to. And once they basically talk about gender equality, which most people think it's really about women and men, actually they then piggyback on it by also saying, well, we then have to have a certain orientation towards LGBTQ people and also trans people. So the way they do it is they don't actually say, sort of that trans ideology go and flourish. What they do is they sneak that in, and it basically the way that it works is twofold. They you kind of apply to be set up a theater in Bulgaria or set up some kind of a art project in Serbia, and then you have to tick all these boxes. And some of the things they ask you is, what have you done for inclusion? And then when you look at the subsection of inclusion, you discover that gender ideology and all these other things are kind of added to it. But I think the reason why they do it is again twofold. They do it because they believe in it to some extent, but they also do it because it's a way of disciplining governments and organizations that take a different view. Because if you, for example, are either indifferent to gender ideology or even hostile to it, but you want to get some money from the EU, you have no choice but to tick the boxes. And that's a way of, almost disciplining them to kind of fall in line.
Okay. Are you familiar with the Denton's document that was, I think it was around 2019? It was drawn up by the law firm Denton's, and it showed the trans activist stealth tactics of tie. They wanted self-ID for children, if I remember correctly, and they suggested, tie it to gay marriage or tie it to anti-conversion therapy for gay people, tie it to something that's more popular. And then you can just slip it in without anyone noticing. Is that the tactic that you think they're using?
Yes, one of my associates actually probably wrote a report on this whole process, the way that the kind of the hidden manner in which this ideology has been promoted. It's a very self-conscious process, because they know that even today, despite all this propaganda, the vast majority of human beings in Europe, don't want to bring about change in the gender of their children. They're not interested. in the kind of policies that this is promoted by. So therefore, the way you get around it is by basically getting certain organizations, particularly cultural organizations, to accept it. And then the other thing that I didn't get a chance to talk about when we had the conference in Lisbon is the role of sexuality education, and the way that sexuality education is spreading all over Europe is very important.
And America.
And in America, yeah. Because what's integral to sexuality education is getting children to question who they are, their identity. And it's almost like they kind of prompt children as young as 6 and 7 to say, all right, you might think, little Mary, that you're a girl, but you might change your mind when you're a teenager. So by putting that into their heads, by socializing them in this particular way, the education system, the sexuality education system, which is being spread all over Europe, begins to, in a sense, have a very major impact precisely on that part of the younger generations who like the independence, the maturity, to be able to handle this kind of discussion.
And why do you think they target children? Sorry, Stella.
No, go ahead.
I think they target children for the same reason that Jesuits have targeted children. They basically, give me a child, and I'll make sure that the child becomes what I want them to be. They regard children as the vehicle, as the medium. So many of the people that are promoting trans ideology or LGBTQ stuff have this idea that people like me or the older generations are gone. They're irredeemable and they're not that important. And therefore, we got to focus on the younger generation, almost save the children from their parents. So it's a kind of typical form of child saving where you encourage children to believe that they understand sexuality or sex more than the parents. And that's what sexuality education says. They basically say, and this is written down in their document, is that you know your body better than anybody else, than your parents. And you might have views about what sexuality is that conflicts with that of your mom and dad. In that case, believing what you are. So basically, they create this intergenerational tension and conflict, and gives them this false confidence that they're really clever, unlike their stupid parents who don't grasp these new developments.
That sounds incredibly familiar and frightening. And it also reminds me of, Mao's China. When you're saying they, and we're talking a lot about they here, who is in your mind when we're talking about they, like what they're doing, and
I think that at the core of it, there's a network. It's what we call the sort of the NGO industrial complex network, where essentially there are groups of activists who are almost like a missionary way, wholeheartedly committed to kind of these kinds of ideals, and they constitute the most important elements in the day. But then they have allies, very strong allies within academia and the universities, who basically provide them with the so-called research and the so-called intellectual resources to promote these things, which are very, very thin. If you actually look at all the trans ideology that's communicated through the journals, they always end up saying more research needs to be done, because it's all quite speculative. But they play a very important role in relation to that. And then what you have are sections of the media or the cultural institutions who are basically drawn towards anything that challenges values and norms that you can take for granted, because they think that any value, any outlook that has its roots in the past is automatically suspect. Whereas if you then argue that, Frank, you're an old fart, you don't realize that there were trans people in ancient Egypt or in trans people all along. Except they always use the exception, but they were hidden from history. We're now bringing them out. We're kind of giving them voice, and that's the kind of that's the way they kind of think, and continually rediscovering themselves in the past. There were people like them, when they were building the pyramids in Cleopatra's time.
And do you have an idea of, like, you're saying NGOs, are these people who like power, or are they kind of ideologically based, or is it a mix of everything?
I think it's a mix of motives. I think the way they genuinely believe that because they belong to an NGO, they're morally superior to people that get elected in politics, or they're morally superior to
Totally.
politicians, or they have this conviction that they're a breed upon. The expression they always use when you talk to them one-to-one is that we're aware, right? And we want to raise your awareness. So the idea is that you and I are, silly, stupid little people whose
Yeah.
awareness needs to be raised by these individuals, and that's really how they think. And the reason why they feel so confident is because they get validated all the time by the media. Particularly, take an organization like Netflix or other California-based cultural institutions. The way they portray trans people as being more sensitive, more interesting than really boring heterosexual people, and the way they kind of the kind of package that they create, it really appeals. It strengthens them, but it also obviously appeals to young people.
Have you seen, just a minor point, have you seen the so-called cisgender flag? Have you seen the flag? It's just various shades of grey. That's the cisgender flag, because we're that boring. All the others are bright and colourful.
Yeah, I think that sums me up. If you look at my hair, it's pretty gray.
Could I ask you a little bit about left and right? I know you wrote a book. Like I say, you're way ahead of yourself. Something like 2005, you wrote a book, The Politics of Fear Beyond Left and Right. And, it's such a heightened point. And I remember somebody was cribbing at me because I think I had invited you to Jen Spector or something. And they said, he pretends to be left-wing. And I was like, does he? But what is your position? And I love that you said beyond left and right. I think left and right should be, I really think it's old hat and it's obsolete, as we heard somebody say yesterday. It's why are we clinging on to the left and right kind of paradigm, and where do you think we should go? Seeing as you seem to be looking to the future, where do you think we should go with this? How can we shake the left and right?
Well, I think you're right to suggest that they become zombie categories, but then we're using a lot of political words and language that is steeped in the past. It's very difficult to break out of it because that was the language that we got socialized into, and that's what the language that they use. Commentators talk about left and right all the time, and it seems to me that we know that these things don't mean very much anymore, because what left used to be is nothing like what people are called left today, because almost all the policies that are identified as left-wing would have been antithetical to left-wing people in the 1970s, even in the 1980s. So we got a problem, and I'm struggling with this, and because I often get asked, who am I, what am I, and everything else. But the way that I look at it is, a lot of the struggles that we need to engage in are not political struggles. I call it struggles that need to be waged in what Hannah Arendt called the pre-political sphere. And the pre-political sphere relates to family life. It relates to the domain of informality, the private sphere. Because, if you to be have a healthy public political life, you need to have flourishing family life and a flourishing pre-political sphere. But if, as is the case now, we have very negative views about this, it's a massive problem. In my own field of sociology, when you look at books that are published on the family over the last 30 years, I can think of only one book by Bridget Berger that's got a positive account of a family. There's a place where you get love and warmth and whatever. Most books on the family always talk about the dark side of the family. And most books on the family have this assumption that, sort of parents are arguing, beating each other up, they're abusing their children. I mean, it's the kind of place that you don't want to be anywhere near if what they're saying is true. So when you have these systematic attacks on what I say, the pre-political sphere, then our capacity to feel like we're human beings a kind of a humanist sensibility becomes very difficult to achieve. And what I argue is that in many ways, what we got to do is humanize humanism, to kind of get back to what we think are the ethical, normative qualities that make people what we are, and then we can worry about political labels. Although in my mind, I got political labels when I describe myself, but they're just for me.
And why the attack on the family in such a way?
I think the family is consequential, very consequential, particularly for the socializing of children. We just talked about the importance of trying to capture young people and the children. One of the things about the family is that it is a very powerful institution. It's a haven from the heartless world. It's something that has protected generations. I remember being in Stalinist Hungary, and where you have very strong propaganda, but that could not penetrate our family. Like within the family, we had these two double languages: the way we would speak outside of the family, where we just tick the right boxes, and in the family, where we just joke about the communist regimes, and we just take the piss out of them and all the rest of that. And you could do that. The family was very, very strong. Not just my family, but everybody's family was very strong. We relied on each other to make our way in the world, whereas today, families have lost that capacity. Not all of them, but family life is much more problematic now than it was in the past.
Oh, that's so sad.
It's more than sad. It's a tragedy because for children to develop a strong identity, to cultivate their sense of independence, they need that kind of family background, that kind of platform that the family gives them, in order to be able to, as I say, I've got a Substack, and it's called Roots and Wings, which basically argues that the two things that we can give to our children is roots.
Yeah.
And once we give them roots, then we can give them wings so they can fly.
That's lovely.
That's being, to some extent, undermined at the moment.
And could I, on that point, because the destruction of the family is such a key aspect of any family who've been impacted by trans, any, trans-identified young person, it destroys, and it goes for the mother, by the way, it's specifically, and no wonder, because mothers are very often the heart of the family. And, it definitely seems to be particularly harsh on the mother. But I think back to the 60s, and kind of the youth culture was promoting kind of the mothers and fathers are beyond our command. The mothers and fathers were old hat. That was arguably when it started to kind of cut in on the family, as in, I really revered the 60s, even though I wasn't born anywhere near them. And it was kind of taught to kind of roll my eyes at my parents from the 60s onwards. Am I right in that kind of, that's where it came from, yours from the 60s?
Yeah, it's really funny you mention that, because I love Bob Dylan, but I don't always listen to the words. So it was only later I just saw the film about him.
Yeah, me too.
Then
I haven't seen it.
I kind of listened to the word, which I kind of missed. But you're absolutely right. And in fact, I had this very funny experience that changed my life, which is, I was like a radical activist. I was involved organizing occupations and strikes and everything else. And one night we all went for a drink, and everybody, all my left-wing colleagues, were going on about the family. The family was really horrible. They hated their mothers, and they hated their dad, and this was so. Then they turned to me and I said, "Well, what do you think?" I said, "Well, actually, I must tell you, I love my mom, and I'm very close to my father. We are like this." And they looked at me as if I was some kind of pervert. I said, how could you, as a radical person, have these strong emotional ties of affection with your parents? And I realized at that point that there was something wrong going on, because either those people were just play acting, or alternatively, their moral universe was so fundamentally different than mine. Because I love my parents, not because I read a book that told me to love them, but I loved them because I loved them. There was a kind of spontaneous closeness that evolved over the years. And I just remember I was just surprised, and they were surprised at me, for having such old-fashioned, outdated ideas.
Whoa. Because I often see the trans-identified kids as kind of similar to, those kids in the 60s who dropped out and they ended up in kind of hippie ghettos and they took a lot of drugs and they raised children around drugs and free love and all that. And it was wild. And it was actually, I remember the first detransitioner I ever met was his parents were children of the 60s. And he'd been brought up in a kind of a off the wall drug commune place in San Francisco. And they'd always stuck in my mind, his life. But I often think that's where a lot of these trans-identified kids might end up, in kind of cloisters, in kind of, I don't want to call them ghettos, but in groups, in houses around certain areas. It might be Portland, it might be, different places. And they completely reject their parents and they kind of live together in their own kind of new families. I don't know where I'm going with this. It's just when you started talking about the 60s, I've always thought that's the most likely outcome for these trans-identified teenagers who are in their 20s, and that's where they're going.
But that style of living never lasts, right? Those 60s communes, it's always a great idea for a while and then it all fell apart. Like, that's not a long-term solution for these young people, I wouldn't think. And my children... Oh, sorry, go.
Go on.
No, my children are the weird kids at school. They've told me this firsthand. My two eldest are in high school. And their friends think they're weird because they like me. They like their mother. They talk to their mother. They tell their mother things, and their friends find that absolutely baffling. They don't talk to their parents at all. I find it very odd.
Yeah, I mean, this is the sad situation we're in, that there is this expectation that there's going to be a generational distancing, psychic distancing between the parents and the children. That's seen as being normal and even encouraged. Fortunately, you're not the only one with kids that love the parents, because there are others as well. But it is becoming a very real problem, because then kids are under a lot of pressure to fall in line, and even if they don't feel bad about their parents, sometimes they gotta talk the talk in order to be accepted by their peers. That is really worrying, and just in general, I think that if you look at the amount of resources that are spent on talking about the tension between generation, just kind of generational discourse in newspapers and elsewhere, and the assumption that the old generations are parasitically living off the younger ones, and that somehow people of my generation have stolen all the wealth from the younger people. This has become very normalized as a way, and this is probably getting worse, sort of in many ways. So it basically creates a very unhealthy sort of dynamic between the generation. Instead of generational solidarity, which is very important for a society, we've got a kind of potential civil war breaking out.
Wow.
Can I bring up, in Lisbon, in your Gen Spec speech, you opened with, I think, just a wonderful opening statement. You said it was something like, we've lost 3 generations of rebels and we've turned them into medical conformists, or something like that. It was a very powerful statement. Can we talk about that?
Yeah, it's something that I wrote in a book called 100 Years of Identity Crisis, the cultural war over socialization. And basically what I've noticed is that the way we socialize children today, and this has been going on for 40 years, is less by educating them about the kind of values that is ours, what is right and what is wrong, what is good and bad, which is the way that socialization usually proceed. And we kind of demoralize socialization. We've taken morality out of it. And instead of talking about virtues or values that we think are really important, we're using psychology as a medium through which we kind of trying to engage with them. And therefore you have a situation, I always remember when my son came back at the age of 8 from his school, and he says to me, that I'm feeling depressed. I'm so stressed out, and he basically sounds like a young Freud, as if he's been reading, the literature on psychiatry. And I said, where the hell did you learn? What did you hear about depression and trauma and being stressed? And then you realize that the narrative that is used in schools in a desperate attempt to raise their self-esteem and in a kind of way of keeping them on track is one that makes them inward-looking, almost like psychologically focused, which is really bad. And one of the consequences, there's two consequences. One is that it weakens and undermines their capacity to overcome their identity crisis, because they think of themselves increasingly not as young children, but as potential patients. And that's one of the things comes about. And the second thing that happens is the medicalization of childhood. So when you look at it, every single year, a new report comes out and says that the mental health crisis among children is getting worse than before. And epidemiologically, it's unthinkable that a medical condition gets worse and worse every year. We don't say, that smallpox gets worse and worse, or cancer gets worse and what. But when it comes to mental health, it gets worse and worse.
Wow.
And it does. It does, because we actually make them sick. That's what medicalization does, is basically a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you treat children in that way and get them to use that language, then they will interpret life as having all these symptoms, all these diagnoses that are sort of so widespread and are flourishing, particularly in the United States, but also in Britain and now in Northern Europe.
Whoa.
Can I jump at? I want to add to that. I don't want to dominate the conversation, Stella, but
please do.
Back to Lisbon again, because I gave the speech in Lisbon, and then you stood up and you asked me a wonderful question that I don't actually think I answered very well, because I was jet lagged and stressed out. And it was, I had said in my speech, I do regret the way I worded my speech, because I said, I was talking about how gender dysphoria is a nonsense diagnosis and it's just a symptom of life challenges or whatever. And then I did say that, these young people, the social contagion kids, they have high rates of autism, ADHD, and borderline personality disorder. And you pulled me up on it, saying, all of the cool, weird, quirky kids of your time are now autistic, whereas they're just really quirky, weird, cool kids, And there's there is the creation of the diagnoses. We join together all of these symptoms, we create a diagnosis, and then we dish it out to kids willy-nilly and medicalize them. But then they make sense of their lives through that diagnosis and arguably become even more typical of the diagnosis. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. It the demand for diagnosis is identity confirming. So you'll find that a lot of parents, a lot of children say, "Oh, I'm so glad that we finally find that the problem with Frank is that he's got ADHD, or that the problem with Frank that he's autistic. Oh, it took us so long to realize this," and it's almost like a relief. You are really glad that your kid has got this particular medical condition, and and as you say, that once you begin to imagine that this is who you are, because it then becomes your identity, then the way you see the world is entirely interpreted through the prism of the diagnosis, and it becomes a lifelong sentence. You then, and I don't know if you noticed, particularly in America, California is an extreme case. What you now have are the same kind of diagnoses that we make with children are now the older generations are demanding to be diagnosed in the same kind of way. So the best example, it's just amazing how older people want to have the same kind of problems that that kids have, because that becomes that explains their predicament. That explains why they're not having a good girlfriend relationship, or why they're nobody wants to get off with them, or anything like that. And so it all becomes due to this kind of condition that you have.
Yeah, all your failings and all your shortcomings are not your fault. It's because I have ADHD or it's because I have autism. Yeah, I agree.
Autism is the worst. I mean, that is a tragedy, that the way that people that we call sensitive, or people who are a bit weird. I mean, I would have been called autistic when I was a kid. Suddenly have this, labeled, branded on them. And then from that point onwards, that becomes a mode of self-understanding.
And it is very sad, because I've noticed, I've worked a lot with children. The great relief that the parents feel about getting the diagnosis in childhood can become a real burden for the young adult when he's in his 20s. If you follow me, he's in a box that, since he was 8 or whatever. So it does access you a lot more resources and help, but it also categorizes you. So many young people I've met, and they keep on putting whatever they're thinking down to their autism or their ADHD. And I don't work with, labels, and I'm like, just let's go in on you. And they can't leave it behind. They think there's gaps in their understanding. And I'm like, we all have gaps in our understanding. And you know what I mean? They really feel throttled by it. The great savior that it was 20 years earlier for their parents is not necessarily going to be such a liberating feeling. But I'm conscious, like you give a great critique, and we could lean in on the critique, but we do have to kind of make sense of this world. What can we do? You know what I mean? To kind of harness ourselves and push back on, let's say, for example, the mass of Europe and policies, and the feeling of that them out there are kind of puppeteering our lives in ways and turning the children against the parents. Do you zero in at all on ways to fight back, ways to kind of counter this society that feels so oppressive when you start studying it?
I mean, there's twofold. I think there is the intellectual cultural battle, where you basically engage and try to expose and call into question many of the new ways of interpreting the world, and demonstrate their shortcomings. But I think the more practical and the most important, here I wish I was like 50 years younger than I am, which is, it seems to me it's really important to take the battle to the schools and to basically challenge the prevailing regime of child rearing. And because basically, child rearing and socializing children should really have as its focus a commitment to educating them for freedom and educating them for independence. Whereas what we're doing now is we're making them powerless and dependent. So I think that the key thing is to challenge the child rearing regime, but also the curriculum, the school curriculum. And therefore, I'm a big advocate of creating new schools, new kinds of nurseries, where the prevailing norms are kind of called into question. I'm a big fan of what I call, amongst friends, subversive parenting, where you seek to subvert the parental regime that is kind of being imposed upon us. Because that's the way. If you can create an environment where children are freed from some of this ideological burden that is imposed upon them, and we begin to socialize them in what I call real values, and there are certain resources from the legacy of Western civilization, things like Aristotelian idea of virtues, courage. I mean, courage is no longer seen as being particularly important, but also things like prudence. I mean, all these values that have got to do with the building of character, building of character, which is character is not something that is internally, and that character is something that is validated by communities and societies. So that's the direction I would like us to move into, because we can do a lot of good with the kids, but some of the generations I think are lost. If you spend the last 30 years living the life of a patient, then you're not going to want to become freed of that and be independent, because you got used to this. And the best example of that tragedy is that in America in particular, we have this idea of extended adolescence, where you only become a man and a woman in your early 30s increasingly. So it's a huge problem because those people are not gonna want to be reminded that they're being infantilized.
It's interesting that you bring that up because I just wrote something about this. Stella and I worked together to write it. The emerging adult. That's what you're talking
That's
about.
right. Yeah, horrible idea.
Okay. So you don't like the concept of the emerging adult because it makes sense to me. Do you want to explain first of all what it is, and then we'll discuss its merits and weaknesses?
The idea of emergent adulthood was developed to explain why it is that biologically mature, sort of men and women are emotionally childlike, and why is it that people do not feel that growing up is a positive process and feel affirmed with the passing of their biological age. And it was developed as an excuse. So for example, in the universities, the people that wrote the book argued that we have got to teach students differently, because whereas in the past a 20-year-old would have been a woman or a man, we no longer expect undergraduates to have the moral resources to have that kind of sense of independence. And what these ideals do, these kind of notions do, is to apologize and legitimate the fact that a growing proportion of basically biologically mature people do not consider themselves to be adults, and there are reasons for that. And one of the most important reasons is the way they're brought up. But the other reason is that there is no validation, there is no moral validation for adulthood in Anglo-American societies. Adults are socially dead people. I mean, that's the way it's represented.
Okay, well, because I wrote about it in the context of trans, in the context of gender, because the group that would be considered emerging adults, so 18 to 27, 29, I'm not sure what the limit is, I think they're most at risk because they're legally adults. They're only adults in a legal sense, and therefore they can consent. They can walk into the Planned Parenthood and get the testosterone, or they can consent to all of these irreversible procedures. But I think in the context of trans, certainly it's a useful concept because the way I was looking at it, I have 3 children. And I was a bit wild. I made most of the craziest, most dangerous decisions in my 18 to 25 stretch. I did the stupidest things. And I think about it in the context of trans, if you're a mother and you're drowning in a sea of dirty nappies and you haven't slept for like 3 months, you're not going to be seduced by trans ideology. You're not going to desire your breasts cut off. You're not, because you've got that adult grounding of being a mother, or if you have a career, or if you have a house and you're set up as an adult, you're not going to be seduced by this poisonous ideology that teaches you need body parts cut off. So do you think the concept of the emerging adult is useful in that sense?
No, because merely because the point is that when you have people in their 20s behaving like children, right, then we need to call that out. That what we have here is basically an attempt to escape from the responsibility of adulthood, which is a huge problem within society. Now, it just so happens that in the domain of what you're describing, in the domain of people living out the ideals of trans ideology in their 20s, that is something that is got to do with a lot of the stuff that happens before that. But by calling into question classical concept of adulthood and the relationship between adults and children, and particularly because this is what's at issue, you call into question the notion of adults' responsibility. That as an adult, your sense of responsibility is very different than that of a child. We basically disempower these people even more than the rest. So that's why I would want to say that we have got to distance ourselves from an attempt to legitimate this thing. Just to give you, I always give the example of horrifies me. I was in Central Park in New York, and it's the first time I've seen this. A couple of guys are walking along, and they have a T-shirt that says "I'm done adulting." I never heard of that. I never heard of the concept of adulting. Since then, I read up, and the very idea that somehow you can switch off from being an adult, is to me so such a turn off that somehow, instead of being proud that you're an adult and a grown up and taking advantage of that, there's something really, really wrong with that whole ideal. And I think that infantilization, which you embrace, is probably stronger with people who identify as trans, but it's it's the same phenomena, but it takes on a more grotesque kind of form than it does with non-trans people. You're looking at me as if I'm an idiot or something. Yeah.
No, I'm really glad we're having this conversation because I've just been writing about it and I'm still thinking about it. So it's good. What do you think, Stella? I
want to go on this. There's a couple of points I want to make. I think the glorification of youth is something that has kind of skewed an awful lot of teenagers into a sense of a grotesque, frankly, feeling of power that they're kind of, they're calling the shots before they're able to. On top of that, the way society has been created, especially in America, but it's come over into, let's say, Ireland and England and other countries, which is that they're going to college and they're dependent on their parents' money, if you follow me, to live. And so it's a really weird power situation where the parents are effectively paying for their life, but the so-called young adults are pretending that they're adults, but they're not living adult lives because they're not paying for themselves. So it's fake, and it needs to be called out. You're not living an adult life when your mommy is paying for your college and and every time I say that, every adult jumps on me saying, you don't understand society. It's been created this way. There's nothing we could do. We have to keep on paying the bills until they're 24, 25. Like, it's really getting older and older and older. We have to pay this and we have to pay that. And so society has created a situation where parents are paying the way for pseudo-adults to live semi-adult lives and semi-childlike lives at the very same time as when we've glorified youth and everything about being youth, like, I'm done adulting, ha ha ha. It's all Beavis and Butthead kind of mentality. I find it really off-putting. But as well as that, I have to throw it in because I know people will be shouting at the podcast as they're listening, saying, but neuroscience tells us that the brain isn't mature until they're roughly 25, 26. And I have looked enough, and it's a brain under construction until then. It's very interesting time, but it is true. So come on, give me your worst on all of that.
Well, just on neuroscience, or what we call neurodeterminism, which is the most popular form of determinism now, where everything can be blazed. Oh, it's this part of your brain, or it's that part of your brain. I don't know if you notice that it becomes this all-purpose causal relationship that you develop. I think that neuroscience doesn't tell us anything. That's got to do.
Well played.
That's my next paper.
I love it.
I'm glad we're having this conversation. No, this is
good.
It's a
good car.
I'm glad. So you don't buy the prefrontal cortex? You don't buy that whole brain maturing up until age 25?
An apostate.
It's interesting.
Yeah, what I think is that the attempt to find a causal relationship between brain development and behavior, it's fundamentally flawed, because between your brain developing is family, community, culture, society, the media, and everything else, which basically kind of mediate the way you come out. And this idea that somehow it's a bit like the old nature and nurture argument, but it takes on a more weird form with neuroscience.
Yeah.
And I think that serious neuroscientists that I've talked to who take their science seriously are much more hesitant about making these big claims about brain functioning and the way you are than the activists.
What about the financial structures that are choking, young adults' ability to be adults. It's a disaster.
And they have to spend longer in college. That's part of it. Like they in order to succeed, they have to spend this long.
Yeah, I'm about to hit into this because my oldest is 17 and she's negotiated a deal off me, which I made a couple of years ago, and she's holding me to, which is that I'm going to pay her first year. She reckons she's leaving home this summer, and I'm going to pay her her first year's rent. And I'm like, yeah, I agreed that in the car when you were 14. Like, how am I getting back to this? So anyway, I'm just entering this part of life.
Anyway, there is an incredible degree of fatalism, which basically suggests that young people are far worse off than my generation or the generation before that.
Oh yeah.
If you look at the whole statistics, it's just not true. But it's not a God-given. When I tell people my son's generation, I started talking to one of his very close friends, that when I was in university in London, we stayed 4 of us in the same, flat, and we had an outside loo. Right.
Yeah.
I'm an outside loo when you think about it.
Oh
I know what you
my!
mean.
They don't actually believe me when I say that. We had the idea of ensuite did not exist in my lifetime in the 1970s. Anyway.
Okay, so can I just what do you recommend then? Because the way I've been looking at it, being a parent grounds you, gives you adult responsibilities. Owning a home grounds you, and these things. I assume you're not suggesting people need to start having kids younger and buying a house younger, are you? What's the solution?
All right. I only got 5 more minutes, by the way. I gotta go.
Okay.
Go. So basically, you raise a very important point, because historically there have been all these signposts. What makes an adult, and there would be things like, sort of getting a driving license, getting an apprenticeship, following in your father's footsteps, sort of getting married and children, and these things have gone. And even as you look at the statistics, even in America, the percentage of kids who are getting driving licenses is just falling.
Yeah.
Right. The percentage of young kids that have a part-time job, like in my generation, we all had part-time jobs when we were 14 or 15, is just falling.
Yeah.
So therefore, all these signposts that are linked to maturity have gone. And therefore, obviously, it is more difficult to make that kind of transition. So I think in many ways, somehow or another, we have to create new kind of signposts which kind of mark out the different stages of your development. I think that's really quite important. And some of us do it. We have family rituals where we basically, from buying a bicycle so you're independent, you allow your kid to have an independent life, and you don't hover over them all the time. So you got to work out these moments, and in that way, actually rehabilitate some of those things, like marriage, which is really important. Not because, I'm not religious at all. Marriage is just important because it creates the potential for stable relationships and therefore a stable family life. So there are these things which sound terribly conservative, but they actually are the common sense. We know that, whether we like it or not, ideally children are better off when they have 2 parents than 1, right? Unconditional love from 2 people is a really important, sort of facet of their life. And if they don't have that, then, they're at a disadvantage. It doesn't mean to say that, 1 parent cannot provide them with all the love they need, but by and large, that's what we know from society. So we have to basically honestly talk about the kind of what I call free political world I want to build and create, and build it in order to go forward and flourish.
We better finish on that, Frank. I'd love to have you back. That was so fascinating. So fascinating.
That was lovely. Thank you so much.
Really enjoyed talking to you people. Sort of, we're definitely on the same page, so that's quite good.
Yeah. I'm going to see you in Europe and see you in Brussels in a month.
Yeah,
really?
I look forward to that. It's going to be a great event. It's going to be a great event, yeah. We're getting some really unlikely people to come along, so I hope you enjoy it.
Great. Thank you so much, Frank.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Take care.